In the heart of Edinburgh, Scotland, lies Greyfriars Kirkyard, a cemetery steeped in history and legend. Among its ancient tombstones and weathered mausoleums, a dark and chilling tale has endured for centuries, the story of the Mackenzie poltergeist. It is said that the spirit of Sir George Mackenzie, a ruthless 17th-century Lord Advocate known as Bluety Mackenzie, haunts this graveyard, seeking revenge on those who dare to disturb his final resting place. On a cold, foggy evening, a group of curious tourists gathered at the entrance of the cemetery, their breath visible in the frigid air. The tour guide, a local historian with a penchant for the supernatural, began to recount the tale. He spoke of Mackenzie's cruelty towards the Covenanters, a persecuted religious group, and how his restless spirit was awakened after a homeless man inadvertently desecrated his tomb in 1999. Since then, countless visitors have reported strange occurrences, unexplained bruises, sudden chills, and even fainting spells. As the guide led the group deeper into the cemetery, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to grow thicker. The tourists exchanged uneasy glances, their skepticism waning as the guide's voice took on an eerie tone. As the group approached Mackenzie's mausoleum, the guide's lantern flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the cold stone. The tomb itself was an imposing structure, its iron gates slightly ajar. The guide recounted tales of visitors being pushed, scratched, or even locked inside the tomb by an unseen force. The air grew colder, and a palpable sense of dread settled over the group. One of the tourists, a young woman named Emily, felt a sudden chill run down her spine. She shivered, glancing around nervously. "I don't feel right," she whispered to her friend, who nodded in agreement. The guide, noticing their discomfort, paused his story and offered to continue outside the mausoleum's immediate vicinity. As they turned to leave, a loud, metallic clang echoed through the cemetery. The group froze, their hearts pounding. The guide's lantern flickered again, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and twist with malevolent intent. Just as the tension reached its peak, the guide decided to lead the group back towards the entrance. As they walked, he explained that the mausoleum had a long history of paranormal activity. Some claimed it was Mackenzie's way of protecting his tomb, while others believed the spirits of the Covenanters were seeking retribution. Emily, still feeling uneasy, kept glancing over her shoulder. Suddenly, she stumbled, feeling an icy grip on her ankle. She gasped, looking down to see nothing but grass and dirt. Her friend helped her up, and they hurried to catch up with the group. The guide's voice continued to weave through the night air, recounting stories of past encounters with the Mackenzie poltergeist. When they finally reached the cemetery gates, the group breathed a collective sigh of relief. The guide concluded the tour, reminding them to respect the spirits of Greyfriars Kirkyard. As they dispersed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. Emily's unease lingered long after the tour ended. That night, as she lay in her hotel room, she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old building, every rustle of the wind outside her window, seemed amplified. She couldn't stop thinking about the icy grip she had felt in the cemetery. In the early hours of the morning, Emily decided to get some fresh air. She stepped out into the chilly night and wandered the quiet streets of Edinburgh. Her footsteps echoed softly against the cobblestones, and the city seemed almost deserted. As she approached Greyfriars Kirkyard, a dense fog began to roll in, shrouding the tombstones and mausoleums in an ethereal haze. Drawn by an inexplicable compulsion, Emily entered the cemetery once more. The air was cold and still, and an unsettling silence hung heavy in the fog. She found herself standing in front of Mackenzie's mausoleum again. This time, the gates were wide open. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she felt an invisible force pulling her towards the entrance. Trembling, she stepped inside, her breath visible in the frigid air. Inside the mausoleum, the temperature plummeted even further. Emily's breath came out in rapid, frosty puffs. The walls were lined with old, dusty plaques, and the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. As she ventured deeper, a sense of foreboding grew stronger. Suddenly, she felt a presence behind her. She turned around swiftly, but there was no one there. Her heart raced as she heard faint whispers, growing louder and more insistent. The air around her seemed to crackle with energy, and shadows danced on the walls, forming eerie, shifting patterns. Emily felt a cold hand brush against her cheek, sending a shiver down her spine. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and she felt a force pushing her towards the back of the mausoleum. Just as she reached the far wall, everything went silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and Emily collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. When she looked up, she saw a faint, ghostly figure standing before her, a tall, imposing man in 17th-century attire. His eyes burned with an intense, otherworldly light, and he raised a hand as if to reach out to her. The ghostly figure spoke, his voice echoing through the mausoleum with a haunting resonance. "You have disturbed my rest," he intoned, his eyes piercing into Emily's soul. "Why do you intrude upon my final sanctuary?" Emily, trembling and unable to speak, could only stare at the spectral figure. The figure continued, recounting the injustice he had faced in life and how his spirit had been bound to the mausoleum by his own malice and cruelty. As the figure spoke, Emily felt a sense of deep sadness and understanding. She realized that Sir George Mackenzie was not merely a vengeful spirit but a soul trapped in his own torment. The figure's expression softened, and he seemed to fade slightly, as if the act of speaking had lightened his burden. With a final, mournful gaze, the ghostly figure reached out towards Emily, his form beginning to dissipate. "Remember me not with fear, but with compassion," he whispered, and with that, he vanished into the ether. Emily, still shaken, made her way out of the mausoleum and back into the foggy night. The air felt warmer, and the oppressive sense of dread had lifted. As she walked away from Greyfriars Kirkyard, she glanced back one last time, feeling a mixture of relief and melancholy.